Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the House versus NCAA case and how they're coming to a little bit of a settlement. But I do want to talk about one of the outcomes of what that settlement could be, which is the end of walk-ons in college football. This is something that obviously we do not want. We've had incredible stories, Baker Mayfield walking on at Texas Tech and Oklahoma and becoming the player he was. Stetson Bennett walking on at Georgia twice and becoming the player that he was. So you don't want to lose those stories by any means, but let's just give you an idea of what this means and why this is kind of happening. So we talked about the roster and scholarship limitations that could be happening through the NCAA or House versus NCAA settlement case, and that is something that has been pushed for quite some time, but it sounds like that might be coming to fruition. The scholarship limits for sports, so it's 85 in football, if you're not aware, would be eliminated. So you would be able to allot scholarships on your team as you saw fit, and you wouldn't necessarily have this big cap on it. The difference is there would be a roster cap on a lot of these sports. Specifically, football would be at 85. So that would mean there wouldn't be those walk-on players that don't get scholarships on your team necessarily. You would have 85 players. They would all have scholarships, and that would just be the way of the world. And this is kind of in a way to help other sports. And I know that's something that college football fans don't love to hear. You want college football to be the main thing worried about at all times of the day. But at the end of the day, there are tons of other sports that you have to worry about, especially with the new payments that are coming up for these athletic departments. And one way to do that is to limit the football spending. And the best way to do that, the most expendable way to do that, is to cut walk-ons from the roster. Now, obviously, walk-ons don't necessarily cost you too much, but there is a cost-cutting effect here where you have to travel with them, you have to get them equipment, you have to pay them what are called Alston payments, which are essentially an academic scholarship that are about 5,000-6,000 per semester. So it's a very interesting thing where you're not necessarily cutting tons of money, but you multiply that over tons of teams and tons of players that are walk-ons. It starts to add up a little bit. Also, it gives other sports a little bit more leeway where the scholarship for baseball, for example, you have 35 baseball players on any NCAA roster, but there are only 11.7 scholarships to spread around that entire roster. That makes things a little bit sketchier, not only for the people that are setting up these scholarships and deciding how to distribute them, but for the players having these kind of conversations and saying, I'm on a point 0.3 scholarship. It's a weird thing to kind of think about. So this would kind of at least make way for more of these guys to be on full scholarship, more of these guys to have that ability, but maybe a slightly smaller team. That could be something else they add into the baseball structure as well. So it's something that is going to be really fascinating to watch. I think it's one of those things where you never want this to happen. You never want a bunch of kids to have that, dream of theirs to play college football at a very high level to be taken away from them. But there are really good reasons for this to be happening, and it sucks that it is, but when you look at, the grand scheme of things and you look at all of the questions that are in front of college football right now, there are going to be sacrifices that are just have to be made, plain and simple. So this is one where it does take away a certain aspect of the game, I'm not going to lie to you, but it definitely does limit some of the money that is expendable. That makes it a little bit easier to, make those books work in a world where a lot of them aren't in the grand scheme of things. But, among cost cutting, there are a couple other reasons why this is becoming such a big thing and why this is likely going to be implemented in the future. And one of them is obviously trying to cut off that future litigation that could come to the NCAA or to some of these schools and all of this type of thing. So definitely something that they want to curb as much as possible. A roster cap is something that's a little bit easier to defend in the court of law than something that is a little bit more arbitrary, like these scholarships limitations or having walk-ons, and it just gets a little bit more confusing than having 85 guys. They're all on scholarship. You know exactly what all of them is getting, at least in that realm of things, and it makes everything just a little bit easier. At least that's what they seem to think with this conversation. And then you have the final one, which is teams are already going over that scholarship limit. Now, it doesn't look like, we're handing you a piece of paper that says you have a scholarship. So they don't have 86 guys that have, written things that say they have a scholarship. But let's be honest, with NIL, with all of the different things that you can give these kids money for, a lot of these kids have a ton of their college education and things covered. And some of them have the entire thing covered. So I think there is that reality where it's already happening. Why not limit the roster space so you don't have the ability to do that anymore? You have the same amount of scholarships as you have rosters, so what are you going to do? You can't go over it because then you're going over the roster cap and then you get in actual trouble with the NCAA. So there are loopholes with scholarships. There's not as much loopholes with the amount of people you're allowed to have on the roster. So that's kind of the easiest way to put all that. And this is something that's been pushed for a little bit here. I mean, Greg Sankey over the SEC, he's the commissioner over there. He's been wanting to do this in basketball and football in particular. It didn't work back then, but it's back now, obviously. So it's definitely something that is going to be really, really fascinating. Obviously, football is going to get the most shine here. It's going to be talked about the most. People are going to concern about football the most. But the reality is, when you look at a ton of different college football players and situations, I think one of the very interesting things is when we talk about college football, a lot of the walk-ons that we talk about throughout the year are the kickers, are the punters, are long snappers, or are Stetson Bennett early on in his career. And I think some of the interesting things is when you talk about those players, you now have to fit them into the scholarship players. You now have to figure out your roster to not only, you're going to have to limit the number of defensive and offensive players you can give scholarships to, because you got to find a way to get it to that kicker, to that punter, to that long snapper, to the, second, third string linebacker that doesn't have a scholarship right now. Because when that roster cap hits, some guys who are currently outside the 85 scholarship positions are just going to have to come into it. And it creates, a little bit of an issue with, roster construction, but also football is a very physical sport. Kids are going to get hurt, and it makes it a lot more imperative that you have kids in your back end that can play pretty much immediately. And with the transfer portal, that makes everything a little bit more complicated. So in terms of a roster construction and roster management standpoint, this is near a nightmare because you had that 35 guys that were not on scholarship that if you absolutely needed them, a break glass in case of emergency type of group, you had them there. You will no longer have them there. You now have to have your starting lineup guys have to be as healthy as possible. But not only that, the backups and the third strings have to be as healthy as possible, because we've seen games where even at the quarterback position, you've had one guy start a game, one guy play the second quarter because the first one got injured, and then someone else finished the game because the second guy got injured. So this stuff happens very, very consistently, and we've seen it in the NFL where you have to decide how many quarterbacks you want to take on an active roster. Do you want to take 2? Do you want to take 3? It's a decision that is a little bit tougher with the kind of grand scheme things, but it's definitely going to make roster construction really tough. It's definitely going to make the jobs of the GMs around the country, the Courtney Morgans of the world, a lot tougher. I won't lie to you. But when you look at the impact on individual players, it's kind of an interesting one. You obviously want players to be able to play at, those big schools. Stetson Bennett being able to go to Georgia is a really cool thing because he grew up a Georgia fan. It was a very fun thing for Georgia fans to have someone like that representing their university. But at the end of the day, if Stetson Bennett, didn't make the first 85-man cut back in, I think, 2017, I could be wrong about that, whenever it was, he would just go to group of 5 team, right? He would just, take that next step down, keep it moving, and, continue to play college football, which to me is a little bit unfortunate to a certain extent, because you want these guys to be able to play where they want, right? If they want to take a walk-on place at Georgia rather than a scholarship place at Troy, that's their decision. And if they want to be a Georgia Bulldog, that's more than fine. And I think that's something that you'll definitely miss with all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, as long as these kids get a chance to play college football, as long as they're on the field, and as long as they possibly have the chance to step up into that Power 5 arena later on in their career, I don't think it's necessarily the biggest hit. It's definitely not what you want. You don't want these incredible stories to go away. But there still will be incredible stories, right? There will still be the guy that is really deep on the depth chart that finds their way into a starting role and blows up. That guy just won't, that guy just won't be a walk-on. That guy will just have his school being paid for. So it's one of those things that I think people will be very upset about. People will be angry about. But once we get into the actual football, once we get into the actual season, I'm not sure if you'll notice very much. And it sucks that, some of these players are going to have to make some different decisions during that recruiting period. But I think in the long run, it doesn't necessarily change the overarching identity of college football. It hurts it a little bit, I won't lie to you there, but it definitely does. It definitely doesn't hurt quite as much as some people might have you believe, I suppose. There is, the opposite direction where they've thought about, doing no roster caps, and Alabama can have 125 football scholarships, and Vandy could have 35 scholarship baseball players because they love that sport over there, and you could have no scholarship basketball players. Like, that is a reality that is out there. Frankly, that would be a really, really weird and more complicated way to go about this, but at the end of the day, you don't want walk-ons to go away. You don't want those stories to go away, but it's still the same kid, right? It's still, he might just be at Troy now instead of Georgia, and he might, not have quite as much ability to become the darling of whatever team they're at, but they do still have the ability to play college football. They do still have the ability to be on the field and possibly make their way up to that higher level. So definitely not what you want, definitely not what you had hoped for this future of college football, but I think it was one of those things that was probably going to be reality. No matter how you cut it, if, I had to make that decision, it wouldn't be the case, but you got to start cutting costs at some point, and that's an easy and efficient way to do it. So stinks for a lot of kids out there and some college football fans for that mystic that is behind all these walk-ons, but at the end of the day, it is an easy and efficient way to cut some of the costs, to continue moving forward, and to keep some of the non-revenue sports alive, which is a huge part of what the future of college sports is about. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that. I think it's going to be one of those things that people are not going to be very happy about, but you'll probably hear that lesson and lesson throughout time. But we're going to take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about Virginia and NC State. They scheduled a non-conference home and home. So I want to get into why they did that, why I don't love that they did that, and why I think it's a very, very fixable problem in college football in general. So I'll break that down for you guys after this, so stick with us.